Welcome back to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. I'm Abby Arnold, sitting down with Hank Stout of Sutliff Stout in Houston, Texas. So, Hank, glad to have you back. Today is episode 6, and we are answering one question every injured rider in Houston asks. What is my motorcycle case actually worth, and what makes the number go up or down? So we are walking through the damages categories that make up the settlement, the catastrophic injuries that drive the value, the comparative fault, and insurer tactics that shrink it, and the coverage and process pieces that decide what a rider actually takes home. So let's get right into question 1. A rider is fresh off the crash and trying to understand the headline number. When a Houston rider asks what their motorcycle case is worth, what actually goes into that number?
Sure, Abby. There's a lot of things that go into it. First is property damage, right? Because most of motorcycle folks really appreciate their bike and the kind of bike that it is, and wanting to make sure that they get good parts put back onto it and that it's running the way it was supposed to be running. Because they're obviously in a significant crash, there can be significant damage, and it may be that the bike is totaled, and then we have to figure out what it's worth, right? So there's property damage. The other components that you have to think about are what are the personal injury damages or the bodily injury damages. And so the law defines what those are, and it's lost wages in the past and the future. In the past, meaning from the date of the collision until trial, and then from trial forward is future. Same thing with medical care, past and future. What is it going to take for your injuries to get treated? And then you have what are known as non-economic damages, which is pain and suffering, mental anguish, disfigurement, things of those nature, which all come into play in a motorcycle accident, because typically motorcycle accidents, unfortunately, can have significant injuries involved with them given the lack of protective space around the rider.
A rider is staring at that first stack of bills from Memorial Hermann TMC. What are economic damages, and why are they the foundation of a motorcycle settlement?
Motorcycle settlements often focus on what are the economic damages. Economic damages are things that you can put a bill to. Medical bills, lost wages. And so what you'll first see is the medical bills that will come in after a collision, and then they'll pile up quickly, and they'll get them for different providers, and you could get 3 bills from the same facility. As a lawyer, I look at all of these things because it helps me define kind of what treatment you've had, what treatment was necessary for your injuries, because they all make up part of your economic damages. It also is instructive to the insurance company and the defense lawyer as to the extent of your injuries, meaning, what were your injuries? What did you get treated for? How bad were they? And so that it kind of helps give people a sense of what happened to you. And then as a lawyer on the economic damages side, it's also our job to go look at, okay, well, we know what treatment you've had. What treatment are you going to need in the future as a result of this collision, and what's it going to cost, right? Because you get one bite at the apple in these cases, and so you have to make sure that you cover all of the damages, not just the damages that happened right after the collision.
A rider with a clean fault picture but a brutal injury is being told the bills are only half the story. So how do non-economic damages work for a rider, and why can they dwarf the medical bills?
That's a really important question. And medical bills and lost wages are very much an important part of any personal injury claim. But the human loss, what I call the human loss, which is the non-economic damages, your quality of life, the pain, the suffering, the mental anguish, the disfigurement. I mean, motorcycle accidents usually involve significant injuries. It can be loss of limbs. It can be, inability to walk. It can be, a life-changing spinal surgery, a whole host of problems that are going to change your ability to do things that you used to do, and change your quality of life. And that has a tremendous value. And so finding the right lawyer that helps you figure out what that value is in your case is extremely important, because insurance companies, because there's no bills to attach to them, generally don't want to give a lot of money for non-economic damages. And so you have to be very aggressive in the pursuit of those damages, because you have to show that, well, insurance company, if you don't want to pay me what's fair, then I'll ask a jury to provide me what is fair, because that is, at the end of the day, who gets to decide? Is the jury gets to decide what your non-economic damages are worth. And so you just want to make sure that you find a lawyer who can really pursue those damages for you aggressively, so that you're treated fairly through the process.
And let's say a family lost a rider in a crash and is trying to understand who can recover and what. And so when a rider is killed, how does Texas wrongful death law value that loss?
So in the state of Texas, when a person passes away, there's two distinct claims that arise. The first is called survivorship damages. Survivorship damages are the damages that the deceased sustained or his estate would have sustained. And that includes the pain and suffering that the person sustained from the time of the accident until their eventual passing. So let's say that they get in a collision and then they're in the hospital for a month fighting for their life. They're conscious, but they can't get out of bed, but they're having all these complications and then they pass away. Under the law, you're allowed to seek damages for that loss. And it also for funeral bills and expenses and medical bills and anything that the person had while they were living. Those all go into the category of survivorship damages. Then there is a different type of claim when a person is killed as a result of the carelessness of another. It's called a wrongful death claim. In the state of Texas, that's created by statute. And what that means is the legislature has decided the categories of individuals who get to recover. The people who can recover under a wrongful death claim are the deceased person's parents, their spouse, or their children. Those are the three categories of people that can make a claim. So sometimes we'll have people that'll call up and they'll be their brother. Well, that brother can bring a claim for survivorship damages, but they don't have a claim for wrongful death damages. Whereas if you're a child, a spouse, or a parent of a person who was killed wrongfully, then you do have a claim and you have the ability to recover damages for such as things like loss of consortium, which is the care, comfort, and love that you would have experienced with the person had they not been killed. And so those are all non-economic damages. There's also economic damages associated with that. So if you're a spouse, what your spouse would have earned had they not been killed is recoverable. And so those are all the different elements of damages that you have and the types of claims that you have when a person is killed by the carelessness of another.
And a rider was, let's say, hit by a drunk driver and wants to know if extra damages are on the table. So can a Houston rider ever recover punitive damages, and what do they add to a settlement?
Sure. So punitive damages are recoverable in the state of Texas. There are what are called compensatory damages. Those are your damages that are compensating you for the injuries that you sustained. So those are your economic and non-economic damages, and those are for the injuries you've sustained. Punitive damages are damages that the law allows you to receive to try to punish the person who caused your injury because their act was so careless. It showed a callous disregard for the safety and welfare of the others that the law says that that person should be punished. And we do that through the awarding of economic or monetary damages. Now, in the state of Texas, there are caps. And so you're limited on the amount of money you can recover in certain instances. And so it just depends on your case, what your economic damages are and what your non-economic damages are.
So damages are the buckets, but the rider's actual injury picture is what fills them. That is where we go to next. So a rider went down hard and woke up at Memorial Hermann TMZ with a head injury. Why do catastrophic injuries like a traumatic brain injury push a Houston motorcycle settlement so much higher?
Well, so brain injury cases are really difficult. A lot of times when you have a brain injury case, there's three different categories of an injury. There's mild, moderate, and severe. Most of your brain injury cases are going to be mild TBIs, but they can still have real consequences. So you look at the person, they walk into your office, they look normal, they can speak normal, but their cognitive functioning is extremely limited, right? So they can't organize themselves the way they used to. They can't their short-term memory is not the same, right? And there's these various tests that psychologists use to try to define the scope of the person's injury. But it really affects a person's activity of daily living. And then as that person gets older, it just gets worse and worse because the strain on the body as you get older is more and more. And so for those reasons, it drives up the value of those cases. But you have to make sure that you have a lawyer that can properly present the case and make sure that the other side understands what the limitations will be and the long-term effects that the injury will have.
And a rider is in long-term rehab after a spinal cord injury, and the family is asking what the case is now worth. So how do spinal cord injuries and paralysis change what a rider can recover?
Well, so when you have paralysis or a quadriplegic or paralysis, it's going to change the person's life dramatically. It's going to, there's going to be a whole host of things as a lawyer that you need to look at. You're going to need to look at, okay, well, what are the medical expenses going to be now? What are they going to be in the future? Is this person going to need what's called attendant care, meaning who's going to help the person on the day-to-day basis? Is the person going to need a wheelchair van? Are they going to need a wheelchair? How many times will they need to replace the wheelchair? Who's going to help them go shopping? Who's going to help them do certain things? And you also have the quality of life. And the damages in those cases are very large. And so you need to make sure that you capture all of the damages, not just the economic damages, but also the non-economic damages.
If a rider lost a leg below the knee and is rebuilding around prosthetics, how does Texas value a traumatic amputation?
So the law says that you're entitled to recover your economic damages and your non-economic damages. And those are kind of painting with a broad brush. And then so when you drill down on the economic damages, you look at what the medical bills are going to be and what they're going to be in the future. And then what reasonably could the person get? You're entitled to the quality medical care and to fix it. So the prosthetics, like how often will you need to fix the prosthetics? Is there a way to give you more functionality and mobility? Are you going to have to require another surgery? If it was a below the knee amputation, that allows for certain things. If it's above the knee amputation, that's going to cause other problems because of the lack and the change in your gait and the pressure that it will add to other parts of your body. Will you need a hip replacement? I mean, there's all these questions that doctors will need to answer. And so as a lawyer, you have to go out and hire experts to talk about what types of problems these people are going to have as a result of the injury, because all of those damages are recoverable. And then you also have the non-economic side of things. The value of a leg. What is the value of a leg? What does it prevent you from doing? How has it taken from your quality of life? And that's what the jury has to understand. Has it impacted your ability to work, right? Where you were doing heavy manual labor and now you can't do that anymore. And so, you were making a really good wage, but you can't do that anymore. So what is that loss, right? And so you will get a vocational expert to talk about that. And then an economist to kind of define, well, this is what you would have made over your work-life expectancy. And so those are all the things that as a lawyer, I'll go out and do and hire these experts to try to help understand what my client's damage model is, and then provide that information to the insurance company so that they too can understand where we're coming from as it relates to our client's damages.
So let's say a rider with a severe road rash and a broken femur is being told that their case is not catastrophic. Road rash and orthopedic fractures sound minor next to a TBI. So how do they factor into the settlement?
I wouldn't call a broken femur a non-catastrophic. It's the strongest bone in the body, and oftentimes you'll have to get a nail put through it to fix it. And so those are significant injuries that are going to cause significant problems, and that nail is going to be there for the rest of your life. You could have complications with that nail. You could have to take it out, so you need another surgery. It could change your gait. If you change your gait, then that'll put additional pressure on your hips, which then will put additional pressure on your spine. And again, it's just having doctors explain all that to you. And through the years of doing this over the last 20 years, I've come to understand and had enough cases that kind of help us figure out, well, what doctors do we need to talk to the jury about our client's problems so that the jury will really understand, and the insurance company will understand, the extent of the person's injuries, so that they can be compensated fairly for those injuries.
That's really good insight on those kind of injuries. So a rider is months out from the crash and might be being told that their case lives or dies on the records. So what role do medical records play in proving the value of a rider's injuries?
So the medical records are a really important part of defining your injuries, right? I mean, as lawyers and insurance companies, we go to the records to see, well, what were you complaining about right after the collision? Do your EMS records mention certain types of injuries? Do your hospital records mention certain types of injuries? What about the records a few weeks out from the injury? Because oftentimes, a person gets injured and then their adrenaline's pumping and they go to the doctor and they're having all this type of head pain and neck pain, but they're also having back pain, but they just don't mention it because all they can focus on is the head pain that they have. And so there's in a polytrauma or a collision in where you're injured in multiple areas of your body, it's not uncommon to see a person have complaints of pain in, say, one part of the body, and then a few weeks later have complaints in another part of the body. And so that's what we're looking at. That's why we look at the medical records, is to try to figure out, okay, what are the complaints of pain and the areas of the body. And so that kind of defines the areas of injury that the person has.
The injury picture builds the case value. So now we walk through what the defense and the insurer do to shrink it. So a writer is being told that the law is going to assign them a percentage of the blame. How does the Texas modified comparative fault rule affect what a writer actually collects?
Sure. So in the state of Texas, when you go to trial, the jury's asked to find first who's at fault, who caused the problem. And then amongst the people who caused the problem, the jury's asked to apportion fault. If your fault is greater than 51% or higher, then you do not get to recover in the state of Texas. If your fault is 30%, then your overall damages are reduced by 30%. So that's the way comparative fault works. Insurance companies will often try to assign blame to my clients for things that are ridiculous, right? The insurance company can say whatever they want until trial because, just like we can say whatever we want that we think the other person's at fault. So both sides get a story and then a jury has to figure out what they think is realistic. But oftentimes, insurance companies' attempt to try to assign fault isn't really based on the evidence. It's just based on the fact that they don't want to pay. And so as a lawyer, you can just kind of disregard that. And if they refuse to be reasonable, then your next best alternative is to go to trial, and which is why you want a lawyer that's going to prepare each case that they have as though they're going to go to trial so that they won't get caught flat-footed in the event that you can't reach a resolution of the case.
So if a Houston writer is found partly at fault and they might be wondering whether their case is completely dead, do they still recover anything?
Sure, they absolutely recover something. I mean, as long as you're not 51% or greater at fault, then you're entitled to recover whatever your damages are, less your responsibility. And that's the way Texas law works.
And so let's say an adjuster is calling daily and the writer can feel the blame being shifted. Why does the insurance company fight so hard to push a writer's fault percentage up?
Well, the reason that insurance company is trying to blame a rider is because they don't want to pay full value for the claim. And so, I've had cases where someone stopped at a red light or at a stop sign and the insurance company is trying to blame my guy who got rear-ended at a stoplight or a stop sign and try to assign blame to them somehow. And so when you hear those ridiculous arguments, it just shows you that the insurance company doesn't want to be fair, that you need to get a lawyer and that you need to have a lawyer pursue this for you so that you can be treated fairly. Don't engage in silly conversations with the insurance company about fault. Hire a lawyer that can go make the case and file a lawsuit and prove that the other side is responsible.
And let's say there's a case where a writer is in jeans and a t-shirt when the crash happened, and then the insurer is really leaning in on it. What is the gear bias defense, and how can it quietly cut a writer's settlement?
Well, there is a bias against motorcycle drivers, just like there's sometimes a bias against other categories of drivers in the state of Texas. There's bad motorcycle drivers and there's good motorcycle drivers. And so, the bad ones give the good ones a bad name. And so there's a little bit of a bias there that insurance companies try to use against the motorcycle driver to say that somehow their case is worth less. But that's why you have to look at the facts and gather the evidence. I mean, if you were following the rules of the road and you didn't do anything wrong, well, then your case should be worth 100%. It shouldn't be worth less. If you were doing some things that probably you shouldn't have been doing, but still weren't, greater than 51% responsible, well, then, we find that it's always better to acknowledge and be truthful with people about where things are and the way you see the facts, because, a jury can see through the dishonesty.
Yeah, that's a great approach. So an over 21 rider exempt under Texas law was not wearing a helmet and is being told it counts against them. Can the insurance company use the fact that a rider was not wearing a helmet against the settlement?
Sure. So if you're not wearing a helmet, they'll argue that you should have been and that you could have mitigated your damages, if you had a head injury, that if you would have had a helmet. It's an argument that they are entitled to make, and then a jury will have to decide, right? And the counter argument is, well, if the negligent driver wouldn't have done anything, or wouldn't have rear-ended the person, or wouldn't have changed lanes when he did, or she did, then this accident would have never happened, right? And so again, it's just going back to getting a lawyer, making sure that the lawyer knows what they're talking about, and making sure that the lawyer can pursue the case aggressively to counter those arguments. But I mean, if you broke your leg and you weren't wearing a helmet, I mean, the lack of helmet has nothing to do with your broken leg.
Once the fault picture and the defense playbook are accounted for, the conversation moves to what coverage is actually available and how the rider gets paid. So let's say a rider with a catastrophic injury is finding out the at-fault driver carried minimum limits. How much does the at-fault driver's policy limit cap what a rider can collect?
So in any lawsuit or claim that you're going to make, you first have to have liability, right? Somebody being at fault for your injuries. You have to have damages, meaning you have to be injured. And then the third thing you have to have is the person who injured you has to have the ability to pay, or you have to have insurance that covers the type of loss that you have. In the state of Texas, the minimum requirements for insurance are $30,000 per person, $60,000 per collision. So if a person has if you're a motorcycle driver and you're just one person on a car and you get hit, you don't have a passenger, then the maximum you can recover from that person's insurance is $30,000. If you carry underinsured motorist coverage, then you can also make a claim for that. There's a high percentage of drivers in the state of Texas that carry just the minimum. There's also a high percentage of drivers in the state of Texas that don't carry any insurance, right? And so that's why we always, try to tell our clients and our family and friends, and anyone who will listen, really, that you really need to ask your insurance company to provide you more underinsured motorist coverage. And so look at that, make sure you have what's called because that coverage will cover you and your family if you get hit by a driver who has a minimum policy, or we get calls on a daily basis of people that have no insurance, right? Where they got hit by an uninsured driver. If you have UIM or UM coverage, well, then your insurance company will cover your damages for what occurred.
A rider's damages blew through the at-fault driver's limits, and they are trying to figure out what is left. So when the at-fault driver has too little insurance, how does UM or UIM coverage rescue a rider's settlement?
It's extremely helpful. We had a case just yesterday that we ended up settling where it was a drunk driver who hit a guy on a motorcycle, injured him pretty badly, and the drunk driver had no insurance. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, what's recoverable? And so we looked, and fortunately there was a UIM policy of, $250 that the rider was carrying. And then they also had what's called an umbrella that also covered their collision. And so we were able not only to make a claim for the $250,000 under the motorcycle driver's policy, but also another $1 million under their umbrella policy. Because the way those policies are written is you're buying coverage to cover the instance of either an uninsured driver hitting you or a driver who doesn't have enough insurance, right? So sometimes the damages in these cases can go into the millions. We've settled cases for $100 million, $50 million, $47.5 million. And so oftentimes people won't have enough insurance for that. So the question then becomes, well, can you go against your own insurance company? And so the more UIM coverage you have, the more ability to recover you have if your case is a catastrophic case. And so in the case of motorcycle riders and drivers, we highly recommend that people get additional UIM coverage because those collisions often involve significant personal injuries.
And a rider, let's say, was hit by an uninsured driver who left no real assets to pursue. What happens to a rider's settlement when the other driver has no insurance at all?
Well, it's a really bad situation, right? And so if you don't have UIM coverage, then there's no ability to recover, right? I mean, unless if it was a drunk driver, you can look and see if there's a dram shop claim to be made, meaning was he served when he was obviously intoxicated? So then you can sue the bar or whoever sold him the alcohol. But those are really difficult claims to make in the state of Texas. I mean, we've made them before successfully. But I mean, you try to look at other avenues of recovery to see, is there somebody else that could be held responsible for what happened? But, if you don't have UIM coverage and there's an uninsured driver and there's no other claim to be made, then unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that things can do you. There's the Crime Victims Fund, but it's limited, I think, to $5,000. And so there's not really a lot of good options.
So a rider is being told the responding officer wrote the rider as at fault on the CR3. How important is the CR3 crash report to the value of a motorcycle settlement?
The crash report completed by the officer is the first thing people go to. As a lawyer, I look at it to give me the basic facts of the case. It's not the end-all be-all. Sometimes we take a lot of cases where the police report says our client was at fault. But once we investigated it, and looked at, video surveillance or drive cams or the physical damage of the evidence, we've determined that, well, the officer got it wrong, and here's why. Unfortunately, some people aren't honest with the officer when they come out there. And so if the rider's in the ambulance being taken to the hospital and the only other person you get to talk to is the at-fault driver, sure, they're going to tell a certain story. So as a lawyer, we'll go out and get surveillance. Was there surveillance cameras nearby? We had a case where they were holding our client at fault on the police report because they said he didn't have his lights on. And so we were on the freeway. And so when we were able to locate a house near the freeway that had video surveillance that showed that the vehicle clearly had its lights on and that the police report was wrong. And so those happen. And that's why you need to hire a lawyer that's aggressive and that can really look at your case and kind of dig in and make sure that all of the facts are discovered.
When a writer is staring at a fee agreement and wants to understand the actual net, how does a contingency fee work, and what does a writer actually take home from the settlement?
Great question. So a contingency fee agreement is kind of a no-fee guarantee, meaning that the lawyer only gets money if and when the case settles, and then if it settles, they get a percentage. And so the percentage comes off the top. Then you have whatever expenses there are in a lawsuit, and sometimes they're a lot, sometimes they're a little. It just depends on the nature of the case. And then you got to pay back your medical bills because your hospital wants to be paid. If you have health insurance, they need to be paid back. And then whatever's left over is the net to the client. And that will all be spelled out once you settle in what's called for us, it's called a settlement memorandum or a settlement worksheet that kind of tells our client, well, this is the money that was recovered. Here's all the various payments that will be made, and here's the net to you.
All right, that covers what makes the case worth what it is worth. Last beat is one piece of advice for the listener and how to reach Sutliff Stout. So, Hank, before we close, give the writer listening right now one piece of advice that they can act on today.
Sure. So if you've been involved in a significant collision where you weren't at fault or you felt someone else was at fault, contact a lawyer. Contact us. We're happy to talk to you about your case and tell you generally what we think and what we think you should do. If we think we would be in a position to help you, we'd be happy to do it. If we think that you could do it on your own, we're happy to tell you that too. And so just reach out to us at sutliffstout.com or call us at 713-987-7111.
If you are a rider in Houston or anywhere across Texas and you have been hurt in a motorcycle crash, call Sutliff Stout at 713-987-7111 to talk to Hank Stout directly. The consultation is free. Thanks for listening to Houston Car and Truck Accident Law with Hank Stout. We will see you on the next episode.